Alright, so I'm going to be talking about another Murakami book, which is always a good time. Everybody loves that, I'm sure. Nobody loves that. And once again, my eardrum is still recovering from being ruptured, so I cannot check any audio levels or what the fuck is going on with the audio to any quality degree. So if anything's off, sorry. So moving on. Today I'll be talking about Dance, 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 translated by Alfred Brinbaum. Or Brinbaum? Brinbaum. Oh my god. We're off to a great start. And the reason that I picked this book is I've mentioned in some of my past few videos that I've been very busy lately. And I always think of being busy is just juggling so many things. And when you've got so many things to juggle, the best thing that I've always found to do is to just keep juggling, focus on one thing at a time, just keep on juggling. And in the book, the metaphor they use is dancing. You just got to keep dancing. And that popped into my head a few times. And I was like, okay, I'll go and reread Dance, Dance, Dance. Especially since it's a book that I have kind of an interesting relationship with, in the sense that it was actually the last Murakami novel that I read before The City and Its Uncertain Walls came out. So it was the one that I ended up reading absolute last of his novels, and it was a really good one to end on, I thought, at the time. And then it wasn't top class. It wasn't like Kafka or Wind Up Bird, where I really wished that I'd read it sooner, nor was it kind of a lower class or one of his earlier works. It wasn't like South of the Border, West of the Sun, which I'm just not a huge fan of, or 1Q84, which is overly long. It didn't have that disappointing aspect to it either. So it was really cool. It was a nice above average Murakami book in my sort of personal ranking. And then I reread it again on coming to Japan, and I found it to be a bit tedious, to be honest. And reading it again, I do find that the early parts of the book, the anti-capitalist message comes off very strong. But one of the things that I really want to talk about with this book in particular is that it is the book, for me, the most, that really drives home the complications with Alfred Brinbaum as a translator. Because to get a little bit into the past, Brinbaum translated a lot of Murakami's earlier novels, which Rubin came into the scene later, but they were doing short stories at the time. Murakami's short stories were translated before his novels, and I think even Philip Gabriel was in the picture doing some of Murakami's short stories for like the New Yorker and whatnot. So I think the trio existed, but Brinbaum was the one who did a lot of the earlier novels. There's a very interesting book called Who We Read When We Read Murakami that I definitely recommend checking out if you're interested in this kind of stuff. That very easy to read and goes into a lot of the history of Murakami and getting Murakami translated in the U.S. But the thing with Brinbaum in particular, and his translation style, is that he takes a lot of liberty. When it comes to translation, anybody who knows or has done any work with a foreign language knows there is no such thing as a perfect translation. Even beyond the balance of translation and localization, do you keep a joke in its original native language, or do you translate it into something that a native speaker of the language you're translating it into would appreciate? And I know a lot of people, that doesn't seem like a complicated question because you want it to be funny, but at the same time, if a joke is culturally relevant or some kind of satire or something, then to somebody who appreciates that and recognizes that cultural aspect of it, can feel like something is missing, or that the book has been too Americanized. It's not exclusively American. I know that a lot of people view Constance Garnett's translations of Dostoevsky's work to be too anglicized, for example. So, but also what gets cut can be a point of a lot of contention, because in what works in a Japanese editorial process, what an editor will do and allow in a Japanese book versus what an American publisher or editor will allow, is very different. And that is why Wind Up Bird Chronicle ended up getting parts cut out, which J. Rubin knew that the cuts would be made and made the cuts himself. He wasn't happy about it, but it wasn't his choice. But the thing with Brinbaum is he takes a lot of liberties, not just in terms of what he cuts, but in terms of the sort of voice. For Brinbaum as a translator, I don't want to put words into his mouth, but my understanding is that he is most focused on flow and voice in his work over accuracy, or really just over accuracy, or over more literal translation, or sort of necessarily capturing the same one-to-one meaning. And to some people, when they think of Murakami and they think about the voice of Murakami that they like, what it is that they're really enjoying is actually the voice of Brinbaum and the way that he has translated Murakami. Because I have seen, since the retranslation of Hard-Boiled Wonderland at the End of the World, quite a bit of people coming out and saying that they prefer Birnbaum's translations because the sort of short, quippy, noirish vibe of it is really how they view Murakami, which, whether or not that's actually Murakami's voice, is, Philip Gabriel and J. Rubin, not that they don't take liberties of their own in translations. Like I said, translation is not a perfect art, but it's definitely it's a spectrum, and Brinbaum is noted for playing fast and loose. And I'm not here to say that there's a right or wrong way to view it, because I don't believe that there's a right or wrong way to view it. But for me, I definitely prefer a more accurate translation. I think that Murakami's prose works well enough on its own. Rubin is my favorite translator because I think he strikes the best balance between Murakami's prose and keeping a flow to it. But even in some of Philip Gabriel's translations, like in Kafka on the Shore, I find it pretty easy to get into the rhythm of the language, and particularly with the earlier parts of the city and its uncertain walls. So I don't mind. I actually like Murakami's prose on its own, and don't really need Brinbaum coming in and making his adjustments and changing and removing things. And it also makes things challenging as a reader, because I don't know when a certain turn of phrase that I particularly like, is it something that I can attribute to Brinbaum, or is it something that I can attribute to Murakami? And that's where I really don't appreciate having that kind of significant translator's voice in the work, which, again, it's a scale. I appreciate that there will always be, to a certain extent, a translator's voice. But particularly with Dance, 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 I found out that there were things that were cut from the book. And reading some of the cut passages made me really wish that they were in there and added back. I don't think it's anywhere near as egregious as Wind Up Bird Chronicle or some of the other cuts that have happened in Murakami's works. But definitely I am hoping that if we ever get an unabridged Wind Up Bird Chronicle, and having gotten a retranslation of Hard-Boiled Wonderland, that Dance, Dance, Dance would someday end up also being there, getting a complete version and an uncut version and retranslation. And not just because obviously I had my personal issues with Birnbaum's translation of Murakami's works, but also because I think that the more translations we have, the more that we can sort of compare and contrast and get a better idea. Because ultimately, when you're working with a translated work, you are working with somebody else's take on that work. And, it is best, I certainly agree, to read something in a native language, but that's not always the easiest thing to do. And I think that people who view translations as not reading the original work don't quite appreciate how even a work written in your native language can offer so many layers and turns of phrases and interpretation that as a second language learner you might necessarily never acquire language to the degree that you can fully appreciate work to that capacity. And if you could, and certainly I don't want to pretend that people who specialize in second language acquisition don't exist and can't reach that level, because they absolutely can, or we wouldn't have translators in the first place. To be able to reach that level in so many different languages that, I read, even right now in my to read, I've got Japanese books, I've got Norwegian books, I've got Portuguese books, and I'm very terrible with second language acquisition. So at that point, the idea that I would need to learn Japanese to that degree or extent, or Portuguese to that degree and extent, or Norwegian to be able to fully understand the book, I appreciate, like, to fully understand the book in its original form, yes. But nonetheless, if translations can give you even 80-90% of an understanding, then it has to be enough, because it's just not feasible for everybody to learn every language. And it's better, I think, to have that work translated and be accessible, even if only in that capacity, than it is to expect everybody to learn the language just to read the book in its native form, in its full original entirety. And ultimately, this isn't a topic video on translations, or the sort of philosophical discussion and value of translations. But it's important when talking about Dance, particularly, and Wind Up Bird Chronicle. But I definitely will never do a video on Wind Up Bird Chronicle. The book is too personal to me. But when talking about this book, I think more than any other, both because so much was cut from it and because of Brinbaum's method of translation, which actually Murakami no longer works with Brinbaum. I don't know what happened between them, because they seem to have a pretty positive relationship, and it has soured, but Murakami just doesn't seem to like the way Brinbaum handled his old translation, so who knows? It's possible that we'll see retranslations of everything that Brinbaum touched. But let it never be said that Brinbaum was not hugely influential to a lot of Murakami's early success in the West. So without him, we probably would not have the Murakami phenomenon that we have today, and or that sort of kicked off. And I sincerely believe that without that, Japanese fiction would not have gotten the in that it did today, and maybe to a broader extent, translated fiction. Murakami definitely was responsible, or played a huge hand in driving those sorts of sales. Anyway, to get on to actual Dance itself, the book is considered the fourth in the trilogy of the Rat, and obviously a trilogy contains 3 books. So why is this one considered part of it? Well, he actually wrote this after he wrote the first 3 books. And then I believe he wrote Norwegian Wood. He wrote Hard-Boiled Wonderland, I think, then Norwegian Wood, then Dance. And for him, it was returning to an old character and the old place to talk about something. And I think he describes it as a healing process, which thematically you'll see a lot in the book as you go on through it. But the important sort of thing with that is that my personal view of the trilogy of the Rat books is that while they do feature the same characters and some of the same settings, the way the relationships are between the characters and the way the characters act kind of changes so substantially between each book that even though it's the same characters, the same places, and that they'll make some references to things that happened in the past, you don't necessarily need one to understand another, because the characters and the way they act, like the history the history is the same, but the actual way that the characters act and behave might as well put them as being new characters entirely. Their situations often change and evolve too. So while Dance 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 does feature the protagonist from the previous books, and it's all about him chasing after a version of an old girlfriend that he had in A Wild Sheep Chase, who disappeared towards the end of that book, and that's not a spoiler, don't worry about it. And in that sense, though, their relationship and who she isn't necessary to understand Dance Dance Dance. And certain things are referenced in Dance Dance Dance, but you don't need to have read A Wild Sheep Chase. It'll just fill in some background plot details, but nothing that will really prevent you from understanding it. And in that sense, I think it's pretty good because Dance 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 feels in a lot of ways like an early, not necessarily an early blueprint, but it feels like a prototype, or where Murakami sort of comes into a lot of how the rest of his books would be written. When I first read this book, I got a lot of echoes of Wind Up Bird, and rereading it again now, I can see similarly a lot of the sort of echoes of a lot of his future works kind of stemming from this particular book, not just in the magical realism stuff, but in the heavy emphasis on Jungian psychology. But I guess I'm getting into themes. I need to explain the plot. Okay, so you have a character, the narrator, the unnamed narrator, who is in his dreams, his old girlfriend, who he later learns her name is Kiki, is calling out to him for help from the Dolphin Hotel, which is a dumpy hotel that they stayed at in A Wild Sheep Chase. So he decides to pack up his humdrum job of writing crappy culture feature of the week articles that nobody really cares about. He calls it shoveling cultural snow, and goes to Sapporo. Is it Sapporo? Yeah, it's Sapporo. Or is it Hokkaido? I think it's Hokkaido. To go to this hotel, and what he finds there isn't a dumpy hotel, but is in fact a towering monolithic not luxury, but luxury hotel. It's not a feature resort, but basically it's a huge luxury hotel. And while there, he runs into the sheep man, who at the end of the previous book was a character. I can't talk about that without going into spoilers, but his role in Dance 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 is quite different. His role is to play as a connector of sorts, to connect the protagonist's life, because the protagonist is going through a bit of a midlife crisis, particularly driven by the sort of consumerism. This is bubble economy Japan. Everybody's making money, everybody's buying things, but everything seems shallow and superficial. And this is particularly driven by the fact that while in Hokkaido or Sapporo, he runs across a theater where an old high school friend of his who went on to be an actor is playing in a scene, and in the scene is making love to Kiki. So this, of course, when he returns to Hokkaido, or not Hokkaido, Tokyo, he makes a point of calling up the old friend and reestablishing a connection there. And meanwhile, on his way back to Tokyo, he ends up looking after a 13-year-old girl whose mother is a very famous figure, and consequently has no time for her daughter. Her father is also, unfortunately, a sort of big figure who has no time for her daughter. And so the girl basically is screwed to sort of be on her own a lot of times. And so it's sort of how he befriends both his friend and this girl, and tries to find meaning and purpose in a world that is sort of so obsessed with image and surface level value of things, and money that can just be thrown away at a world's whim because nothing has any real value. even down to human life, because several characters do die throughout the story. None of the main characters, and that's not a spoiler, but there are deaths throughout the story, and it's sort of how everybody responds to that. So, would I recommend this book? Well, rather, to whom would I recommend this book? If you've already read Wind Up Bird Chronicle, Kafka on the Shore, Norwegian Wood, I personally have a soft spot for Killing Commendatore, but if you've read the big Murakami books, this is where I'd say you go next. Alternatively, if you are a fan of Brinbaum's translation style, Brinbaum's spin on Murakami, this is where I would suggest that you go. It's not where I would suggest you start with Murakami, but it's not the worst place in the world to start either. So, I mean, it's a Murakami book. I love Murakami. This channel could just be renamed I Talk About Murakami, regardless of what fucking book it is. But there you go. That's my recommendation for Dance, Dance, Dance. So moving on into the pros and the cons. In terms of the pros, I think that it's very, very interesting. I like the characters. I like the way they're written. I like Yuki in particular, who is the girl. And I'll kind of get in the themes. But one thing I want to talk about, I guess, here, since my format has already been thoroughly fucked this video, Murakami gets a lot of shit for the always having underage girls spending time with older men, but I think that a lot of people end up missing the point to a lot of his work, which is a lot of children in Japan are being left without parents and without adult figures to look after them and take care of them and grow up. So they're in these situations where they end up with older people. And it's not just... It's such a recurring theme in his books, and it's not just underage girls, but Kafka in Kafka on the Shore is 15, and the submarine... Yellow Submarine Boy in The City and Its Uncertain Walls also is unable to have a sort of strong connection with his family. So, you know, a lot of people get drawn into that sort of, well, it's uncomfortable, it's pedophilic, but I really do think the primary thing that Murakami is saying in a lot of this is the sort of failure of parents to look after their children. In Dance, 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 both of Yuki's parents are so caught up in the rush of being wealthy and successful that neither one of them is able to connect on a real level with their daughter. I mean, the mother even wants to be friends with her daughter rather than be a mother to her daughter. And it's how the protagonist and her end up bonding over just the fact that they're sort of outcasts and alone with nobody really around them. Marie in Killing Commendatore talks to the main character about her development, her breasts specifically, as because there's no one else for her to talk about her development into a young woman, because her mother died and her father is too busy being sucked dry by cults to be there for her. And the only person she can really talk to is an aunt who's been looking after her and she's close to, but she's almost too close to the aunt. The aunt, she feels like she's responsible for ruining her aunt's life, or is worried that she is impacting her aunt's life in that way. So she can't really talk to her aunt about it, so she's stuck talking to the main character. Meika Asahara in Wind Up Bird Chronicle, her parents ultimately are too straight and narrow to be able to understand their sort of free-minded, sort of liberal, thinking outside the box daughter, and because they're so inside the box and she's so outside the box, she is unable to get sort of the support that she needs. Kafka on the Shore, again, Kafka's mother left him and he feels he needs a mother. He feels that she left him behind because she didn't love him, and his father doesn't love him at all, and sees him as a sort of symbol of that failed marriage. So, and Yellow Submarine Boy also had a home life where his mother smothered him and wouldn't let him ever sort of develop into his own. The point being, like, none of these, by the way, are spoilers, because they're just the natural state of all the children. And it's such a recurring theme in Murakami's work, and I've never seen anybody bring it up. And this is where I talk about, like, in Dance Dance Dance, you'll see a lot of things that go on to become staples of his work. And I believe this is the first time that you see a young child like that. And I know a lot of people are uncomfortable with the idea of an older man spending a lot of time around a younger, I say older, but, a man in his 30s spending time with a 13-year-old girl. And I agree that it's messed up, but the characters, for fuck's sake, acknowledge that it's messed up and it's not right. And I think to overlook that is to really miss the point of what he's saying and what's going on here, and to let your own insecurities and immaturity bleed into the work, because I think that it's really well handled in this book, and a really poignant takedown of the way that people constantly foist their children onto society to raise them while they go off and do their own thing and make their money and whatnot. And nowadays, especially with technology, the way that parents are basically just looking to get out of doing their job as parents. And I think that's portrayed very well. In terms of a con, I have mentioned at the start, I don't like... The early part of the book goes a little bit too hard into the anti-capitalist message, which it's not that I have an issue with the anti-capitalist message. It's just that it's so blunt in the first 50 pages. The number of, I guess they're redeveloping the area, and the Dolphin Hotel was bought out by the old guy because a bunch of politicians subtly forced everybody off their land and even got the Yakuza involved. But hey, man, that's advanced capitalism at its finest. And it's kind of cynical in a way that Murakami usually isn't. In fact, on the whole, I find Murakami a very uncynical writer. And it's one of the things that I like about him, which the sort of cynicism in those first 50 pages feels really misplaced, especially when it's explored so much better once the story gets going, and especially through Gotonda and some of the other characters, that I think that the first 50 pages or so, just that could have been toned down, and it grates on me. The second time I read it, it grated on me so much that I never really recovered and was just kind of like, oh, it's the anti-capitalist book. But reading again, I think that there's a lot more going on here. And bump. Professional. Good job. Yeah, pro. And this is where I kind of go back to, is this Murakami just a sort of younger, less mature writer? And the way that he's writing about this situation, is it sort of angry young man energy coming into this work, because at the time he would have been an angry younger man? Or is this Brinbaum sort of heightening those aspects of the writing and letting the other aspects fall off, because it creates more of that cynical, noirish protagonist and atmosphere of the book? I don't know. And this is why I would love to have another translation, is just even to compare the two and see if it still comes across with that voice. So going back to the prose, I like the length of the book. In a way, it can feel like it drags, because there's like a vacation to Hawaii. It starts out in Hokkaido and then goes back to Tokyo, and then they end up in Hawaii, and then they end up back in Tokyo. And there's a very globe-trotty feel to it, just in terms of winter in Hokkaido, spring in Tokyo, summer in Hawaii, which the Hawaii thing can feel definitely like a bit of an aside, and I can see somebody feeling like it drags there. But I think on the whole, the pace is very nice. It's very clipped. It doesn't feel like it has a lot of empty conversation or dead space. Most of the things that happen feel like they either progress the story or the themes forward. And again, it doesn't tie together superbly, because you have Yamiyoshi. Oh my god, I don't... Is that her name? Yumiyoshi. Yeah, that makes more sense. Yumiyoshi. in Hokkaido, and the main character meets her in the beginning and grows attached to her and calls her a few times in Tokyo, but she doesn't really appear again until the end. And I feel like that could have been integrated a bit better into the story. But definitely in terms of being a kinetic novel, there's a lot of movement to it, in contrast to something like Wind Up Bird Chronicle or Killing Commendatore, where personally I like the more laid-back vibes. I like the more meditative, contemplative vibes, but I also like Dance Dance Dance's more energetic vibes as well. So I think that's something that the book does well. In terms of cons, this is kind of difficult to talk about, again, without sort of getting into the themes. But the book, Jungian psychology is an important part to understanding this book. And I hesitate to talk about that in the sense that Jung is next to Freud in terms of everybody tries to apply a Freudian lens to everything, even when it makes no sense. Everyone tries to apply a Jungian lens to everything, even when it makes no sense. Or sometimes it can be like interesting, but it's so obvious that, you know, the writer wasn't writing to this intent. You know, like Dickens wasn't writing Freudian literature. You know, you can obviously take it through that lens, but to say that Dickens was writing Freudian literature is wrong. But in this case, I go back to Kafka on the Shore, and one of the important things in Kafka on the Shore is Plato and his theory of couples, everybody missing half of themselves, and Hegel and the concept of relativity. And the reason that you know that those two things are important to the story are because it's actually woven into the plot that somebody brings it up. And I like that because I dislike it when something is considered deep just because it necessarily reflects or draws inspiration from a sort of psychological or philosophical concept. To use a video game example, Persona, just because they represent the concept of a shadow and the concept of a persona doesn't mean that they are in-depth explorations of Jungian psychology. And Dance Dance Dance, the reason that I do mention that I think it is very much Jungian psychology is because one of the characters outright mentions Jung in the book, but just kind of in a passing way. But also the word shadow is brought up multiple times in the book, and it's always italicized. And the shadow is part of Jungian psychology. And the multiple journeys into the main character's subconscious and how the main character is constantly coming back to this place in his subconscious. And like I saw it suggested somewhere that Kiki is representative of the main character's anima, which is like a Jungian concept of femininity and whatnot. And it wouldn't actually surprise me in this book if that was the intent. Like I said, it's mentioned, Jung is directly mentioned in the book, and the word shadow, which is the one term I know, is mentioned and italicized in a way to specifically draw your attention to it. But the reason that I'm sort of listing this in the cons is where something like Kafka on the Shore brought up its philosophical concepts in a diegetic way to sort of introduce you to them and give you that understanding. Granted, I think that the book still stands on its own, and the same with Dance Dance Dance, but to sort of realize that there's this entire sort of subtext to the book that I am not well versed enough in Jungian psychology to really appreciate, and it feels like a pretty heavy part of the book. Like, to really sort of understand it at its fullest, you would need to understand these topics, and I just wish that the book sort of gave you some sort of diegetic clues for how to interpret those themes, or brought it up in some sort of diegetic way, because I don't necessarily mind going out and, you know, reading and doing the research, and I'm sure I will at some point, but it just seems like it's asking a lot for you to have already understood or had a basic understanding of that going into the book. But I still think it's a good book on its own, and you can enjoy it without it. But that does seem like a key to fully understanding it, that the book itself is not providing enough context for without outside material, and I'm not a huge fan of that personally. But with that being said, I still think that there's more good than bad in the book. I think the plot is interesting. I think it wraps up in a satisfactory way, which for some of Murakami's books, I know they can seem kind of ambiguous in the endings, but I don't think there's anything ambiguous about this ending. Wraps up well, like I said, is paced well. I like a lot of the characters. I like a lot of what is being said. I think you can see a lot of the ideas that Murakami goes on to develop a bit further in this book, but there's a sort of energy to it. And again, I don't know how much of that is Brinbaum, how much of that is Murakami, but there's an energy to his book that a lot of his later, more meditative books don't necessarily have. So it's definitely worth a read. I think it really captures what Murakami went on to be. If there's one book that I think I would say this is where like the Murakami as he would go on to be known starts, it would be here. Like Wild Sheep Chase is where he started with magical realism, and then Hard-Boiled Wonderland and Norwegian Wood were kind of both offshoots, one into science fiction and one into the sort of hardcore science fiction, one into downright realism, and then with Dance 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 he sort of found the balance and the sort of magical realism and surrealism that would go on to define the rest of his career. So themes, oh my god, I've already talked about so many of the themes just getting to this point. Advanced capitalism, Jungian psychology. But the sort of big thing that I wanted to mention with the Jungian psychology that I didn't mention in the when I was talking about it earlier, because I wanted to talk about it, themes, is the way that it's not just using the Jungian psychology to sort of make itself look smarter by making that connection, but it's combining Jungian psychology through the lens of living in an advanced capitalist society. Again, this is a sort of post or bubble economy in Japan. Everything is a commodity. Everything is being bought and sold to the extent where money and goods have no meaning. Whether it's Yuki's father or Gotonda himself talking about how everything is a tax write-off for them. And yet, at the same time, for Gotonda, everything is a tax write-off, but he talks about how he's also horribly, horribly in debt. So, on the surface, everybody wants his life because he looks like he can have everything, but he states multiple times that he can have everything except what he wants. His relationship with his ex-wife is in shambles, but he still loves his ex-wife, but she has a connection to him, but she'll always side with her family, and he wants to just sort of pack it all up and go and live a regular life, but she could never have that, and ultimately that's what leads him to commit suicide, is the sort of unwinnable situation of everything he wants he can't have, and everything he doesn't want he gets in spades. And it leaves him empty. It leaves him sort of feeling nothing. He describes some earlier acts of cruelty, which are very in line with a murderer, which sort of underlines the possibility that he did murder Kiki. But if he did so, it would have been, I get the impression, mostly just to feel something, because his whole life has been such a matter of illusion. And that's sort of advanced economy, Jungian psychology, but the third major, failed parents who aren't there for their kids. But the sort of other major theme that I think is important in this book is the sort of balance between illusion, how things seem versus how things are. The main character repeatedly compares people to Gotonda, and how Gotonda would be a better be a better police officer than the police officers he ends up involved with. Or he mentions that Gatonda is a better dentist than looks more like a real dentist than a dentist. And for me, the subtext to all this is how capitalism sort of sells you on the sort of flashy lifestyle, like something has to look more than it is in order to convince you that it's real, or it seems more real than the real version of the thing. I see this a lot in like fruit and produce, where if a tomato is big and red and really, deep red with a nice green stem, it's been, sort of genetically modified to look like what most people would assume a tomato looks like. But in doing so, the flavor ends up being so drab that I think I've mentioned this in the All Over Creation review. A real homegrown tomato will definitely not look as nice, but the taste will be a whole lot better. And that sort of dichotomy between the sort of surface glitz of capitalism versus what the reality of the situation is also, I think, lies at the core of this book, and is reflected in the two characters, Gatonda, who has everything but really has nothing, and the main character who also has nothing but has something at his core, sort of desire to connect and be with other people, somebody who hasn't entirely given himself up to the system yet. He talks about shoveling cultural snow, but at the end of it, he has done not middling stuff. He spends most of the book not doing his job. He's able to, like most Murakami protagonists, has money in savings. Very convenient for Murakami protagonists. I wish I could relate. And they spend a few months not working while they go on this journey. And in the end, he decides to quit that job and get a new job and write for himself, because this is sort of not being so bound by the need to put on an appearance, put on a show for everybody. The ability to just, at the end of the day, be himself allows him the freedom to not submit completely to the sort of capitalist dead-end rat race, which drives all of the other characters in the story, with the exception, of course, of Yuki, who, in her own way, sort of serves as a counterbalance to Gatonda, where Gatonda lives sort of this vapid, empty life. Yuki is the victim of the people who do live that vapid, empty life, and she serves almost as a grounding for the protagonist. And this is where maybe if I knew more about Jungian psychology, I might be able to phrase this and understand exactly what Murakami is going for with this. But this is where I'm saying I don't think you necessarily need the Jungian context to appreciate that, Gatonda and the protagonist are very similar to each other, but almost in an unhealthy way, because they kind of reflect the worst parts of each other back at each other. And it's really when he spends time with Yuki that Yuki and Yumiyoshi, that he is grounded, and he even mentions at the end a need to sort of come back to reality with Yumiyoshi. And so I don't know what they necessarily represent in Jungian terms, but it's easy to see what they represent in terms of the plot and the themes and what's going on here. And I think that's really the most important thing for the book, is that it stands on its own. But there is definitely this very important side of the book that I am missing, which really takes the piss out of talking about themes, because like I said, there's so many. I mean, there's other stuff I could talk about, like Yuki's development, Yuki's sort of psychic powers, Really, the skeletons and the fact that there's one skeleton unaccounted for at the end of the book, but the fact that the skeletons were sort of inside the protagonist the whole time. So maybe there wasn't necessarily ever going to be a sixth skeleton, and it was just a version of himself that has changed now that he's changed. And the sort of death aspect that I mentioned earlier, and how Kiki dies, and how Mei dies, and how, again, okay, going back to sort of what I talked about, the surface versus the reality, where there's this prostitution ring, but they put a really nice face on it, really professional look on it, and at first everything seems on the surface, it seems great, it seems safe, but there is this dark side where a girl gets strangled in the prime of her life. She's very young. There's no even reason for her to necessarily be doing this type of work, and she ends up dead because no matter how nice a face you put on it, it's still a very dangerous proposition for a girl to go out and meet an unknown man in a random location. And you can put a nice face on it, but there's still that danger at the end of the day. And Kiki is probably dead. Mei dies. It's pure chance, but Dick North, one of the other characters, ends up dead. So it's sort of the illusion that everything is nice and safe, but the sort of undercurrent reality is that this sort of violence still happens, and particularly violence against women and prostitutes in particular is a huge part of this book. And I think sort of the last thing in closing is Gatonda talking about the choice to kill himself. What I think, whether or not Gatonda actually killed Kiki, and he probably did, I think is secondary to the fact that even if he didn't, it's important to him that he did, insofar as he has been looking for a way, and the main character mentions this at the end, to end his life. He's been looking for an exit. He's been trapped ever since he was a child, because he talks about the way that people looked at him as a kid, and everybody was always all eyes on him because he was so attractive in everything he did, that he was never allowed to be himself. He always had to be putting on a persona, to use a Jungian term, in front of everybody. And now his life, that persona became his life, and he was never allowed to be himself. And he just got so tired and so sick of it all that he was constantly looking for a way out. So whether he actually killed Kiki, or whether this is another symbolic thing in Jungian psychology, where Kiki was his shadow and he strangled her, or whether Kiki was his, I think it's like an anima or something, and he's killed that. There's something fundamentally missing from him as a person, and he knows that he doesn't have what it would require to get it back. And the sort of tragedy of a system that commodifies people so much that even in their death, they're nothing more than something for magazines to rip apart, to go at, to sort of make money off of and profit from. And I think, again, this is where I come back to, if I look at the way that the book handles Gatonda's death at the end of it versus the sort of sheer cynicism that happens at the start of the book, that's where I feel like you really sort of see the difference in terms of the Murakami that I know, where he can handle heavy subjects and really bleak subjects, but still, I think, give this element of hope to it, sort of through the main character and how the main character learns from it, versus how sort of just cynical and bleak the main character is at the start of the book. And maybe the idea is that the character sort of undergoes a transformation, and that's what the cynicism, but the problem is, I don't buy that, because the cynicism at the start of the book, the sort of anti-capitalist cynicism at the start is fairly well the same theme that's going on at the end of the book. It's just being handled better and with less of a cynical outlook. So I guess I have to backtrack on that. So ultimately, I have spent 50 minutes talking about Dance Dance Dance, just talking, and I don't know if I've said anything of value, or whether or not I've said anything of value about the book, but that should give you an idea of the things that you can get from the book if you look into it, really. So next time I will be continuing going through Wolves of Eternity. As I mentioned in my last review video, I was sort of reading these books simultaneously, but then I just wanted to go ahead and get through Dance Dance Dance. It ended up taking most of my attention. So back to the Wolves of Eternity, and that's a long-ass book, so no idea when that review is coming. So enjoy this big, long, meaty boy. Goodbye.